The last place I ever expected to find clarity was on a yacht anchored just off the California coast, surrounded by people who shared my last name, but rarely shared the truth. My name is Marjorie Wells. I'm 38, and for most of my adult life, I've lived in the shadow of the Preston family name, a name I married into, not one I was born with. That detail has always mattered more to them than it ever did to me. But this story isn't just about names, it's about silence. And what happens when it finally breaks? It was the third night of the annual Preston family retreat. The wine had been poured, the seafood flown in from Seattle, the yacht polished until it gleamed like a stage. Everything was choreographed, especially the closing dinner. That's when Valora, my husband Lial's sister, stood to give the final toast. She wore a pearl-colored dress and a smile so tight I wondered if her face hurt. Her voice was warm, sure, like someone used to being quoted. "I just want to thank everyone for being here," she said, gaze sweeping across the table like a lighthouse avoiding one rocky spot. "This gathering isn't just about luxury, it's about legacy. It's about the people who understand the value of what we've built together." She didn't look at me, not once, but I felt the exclusion like a cold breath on the back of my neck. Lyle, my husband, sat beside me, stiff. He always noticed, but rarely intervened. His role was peacekeeper. I used to think it was noble. Now I wasn't so sure. I took a slow sip of water, watching her glass rise to her lips in the glow of the overhead lights. I let the quiet spread around me, wrapping itself around the clinks of silverware and the rustle of linen napkins. And then, when the moment ripened into expectation, I stood. "I'd like to add something," I said, not raising my voice. "About legacy." Valora froze mid-sip. Lyle's eyes snapped to mine. I reached down to the leather folder I had tucked under my chair and pulled out a few pages. The top one had the company logo in the header. I laid it gently in the center of the table. "It's from a Zoom call last month," I said, "between Valora and a legal consultant from Preston Holdings." A couple of relatives leaned forward. Lial didn't. He sat like he'd been turned to stone. My finger tapped a sentence I'd highlighted. "She's not blood," I read aloud. "She shouldn't own a family asset." Valora's face drained of color, but she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. I wasn't finished. "This," I said, sliding a second document onto the table, "is the purchase agreement for the yacht. The initial down payment was made by me. Marjorie Wells, sole investor, legal co-owner, listed first." No one moved. You could hear the sea lapping gently outside the hull. "I'm not sharing this for drama," I continued, my voice low but firm. "I'm sharing it because I'm tired of being spoken about in closed rooms, like I'm not standing in the next one." I looked at Valora, who was still gripping her wineglass like it might anchor her to reality. "For years," I said, "I've let things slide, snubbed invitations, comments made just loudly. Credit quietly. But this isn't about being included anymore. It's about being seen." We all finally spoke. "You didn't know she was doing this," he said, staring at my sister. "Valora, why?" "I was protecting the family." "I didn't mean you thought I said drama," I said, and my voice trembled. "Not for weakness, but for strength." And you were almost right. My cousin coughed into her nap. The chair scraped the floor. Auntie Fanny, the oldest woman at the table, and always the first to pretend nothing was wrong, tried to redirect. "Perhaps we could table this for another time." "No," came a voice from the far end. It was Harold, a distant cousin, who barely said a word in 3 years of retreats. "I think we've all been told a different version of things." Heads nodded, not defiantly, not angrily, just, finally. I looked at Valora. She looked so small then, like the weight of pretending had finally settled on her shoulders. "You can keep building your version of the story," I said, gathering my papers slowly. "But not on top of my name." I slid the folder closed, one motion at a time. Before I walked out, I paused. If you want the truth, I said, turning back only once, don't ask the loudest voice in the room. Ask the one with the receipts. The only sound left was the water brushing against the hull. No more toasts, no music, just quiet. And behind me, the doors are closing. I walked the outer deck barefoot, my heels dangling from one hand, the teak wood cool beneath my feet. The ocean was black velvet under moonlight, gently folding into itself, like it knew how fragile everything had become inside that boat. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was something slower, something deeper, like the moment just before tears fall but never do. Everything I had said at that dinner table had been sitting inside me for years, waiting, scratching at my ribs, pressing into my lungs. Now that it was out, the silence left behind wasn't empty. It was honest. Small groups had splintered after dinner. A few cousins slipped away to their cabins. One of Lyle's uncles pretended to check on the engine room. Nobody followed me. As I passed the lower deck, I heard her voice, Valora's. Not loud, not rehearsed, just bitter. She took it, she whispered through the half-open door to someone I couldn't see. It was always meant to be mine. The sentence hung in the air, sharp as salt in a wound. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. She hadn't said sorry, just that she'd been caught. Back in our cabin, Lyle stood by the dresser, folding a shirt he hadn't worn once this trip. That's what got to me more than anything. That small, pointless act. Like he could pack away discomfort, smooth the fabric of what had just unraveled. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. The room buzzed with things we hadn't said. Finally, he spoke. I think I always knew, he said, his voice low, like he was trying not to wake something dangerous. Not all of it, but enough. I saw how she treated you. The things she said, the invitations that didn't come. I thought if I just kept the peace long enough, it would work itself out. I didn't interrupt. I didn't pat his hand or say, it's okay, because it wasn't. Not really. I let her write the script, he admitted, because I didn't want to be the one to ruin the show. I nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the first real thing I'd heard from him in months. You still let it play out, I said, not bitterly, just truthfully. I know. I pulled back the covers, slid into bed without saying more. He didn't push. Some nights, the sharpest sentences are the ones that go unspoken. Morning came slowly, wrapped in fog so thick it blurred the edges of the horizon. I sat in the lounge before anyone else stirred, fingers around a mug of black coffee, the steam curling like a question I hadn't figured out how to answer. One by one, they appeared. Maddie, Lyle's cousin, always polite, never brave, lingered near the fruit tray. She didn't make eye contact, just said, I should have spoken up a long time ago. Aunt Denise, the one who once told me I was too serious, quietly placed an extra spoon beside me for the sugar I never took, then walked away. Even Ron, Tom's older brother, who had barely spoken 3 words to me in 2 years, muttered as he passed, Saw it coming, just didn't think it'd crack like this. No one said they were sorry, but each of these little gestures stitched something back together, something more honest than all their forced smiles ever had. That night, back in the cabin, I lay awake. I didn't think about Valora. I thought about the version of myself who had survived her. The woman who smiled too widely at family dinners, who offered to help and was told she didn't need to. The one who baked desserts from scratch and still wasn't asked for the recipe. That version of me had tried so hard. She bent herself into shapes small enough to be palatable, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, nodded when she wanted to scream. I mourned her, not because she was weak, but because she was exhausted. And no one noticed. It wasn't grief exactly. It was something quieter, a kind of letting go. At 3 a.m., I climbed out of bed and opened the folder again, not to reread, just to hold it, to remind myself I hadn't imagined any of it, that the truth wasn't some fever dream. It had names and dates and ink. It had receipts. By breakfast, the fog hadn't lifted. Not outside, and not inside the dining room. Scrambled eggs were served on warm plates. Fresh-cut fruit glistened like nothing had happened. But the conversations were hushed. No idle chatter about weekend plans. No curated laughter for Instagram. They didn't avoid me now, but they didn't rush to include me either. They just watched, like something sacred had been unmasked, and no one quite knew how to honor it. I sat at the end of the table, hands around my mug. Not triumphant. Just present. And that, somehow, shifted the air around me more than any victory speech could have. My phone buzzed around 10. I stepped out to the lower deck, answering instinctively. "Marjorie," said the voice on the other end. It was Ronald, the Preston family's longtime lawyer. Careful, precise, too smart to call without a reason. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "For even entertaining the draft paperwork, Valora tried to put it through. I knew it wouldn't hold, but I should have shut it down sooner." I said nothing. Let the quiet speak. "You were always the rightful owner," he continued. "On paper, yes, but in spirit, too." He didn't say more. Didn't need to. I thanked him and hung up. The waves rocked gently beneath me, like the boat was nodding in agreement. Back upstairs, I found Callista, my friend and occasional business partner, curled into the lounge sofa with her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keys. "I posted it," she said, not looking up. I didn't ask what. She turned the screen toward me. There it was. A personal essay, beautifully written, piercing. My name is in the byline. The woman they tried to erase. A lesson in silence, ownership, and standing your ground. "Do you want me to take it down?" she asked. I read the title again. I thought about everything it took to write that piece, even if I hadn't typed a single word of it. "No," I said. It had already racked up comments, shares, strangers, mostly women, leaving notes about how much they recognize themselves in the quiet strength of the story. "This isn't revenge," I said softly. Callista smiled, warm and proud. "No, it's record-keeping." That afternoon, I stepped out onto the stern of the yacht, where Lyall stood alone, hands tucked in his pockets, eyes tracing the horizon like it might offer him a direction he hadn't yet considered. He turned as I approached. His face was calm, but there was something raw behind it, like he'd finally stopped pretending to be okay with how things had been. "I've been thinking," he said. "Some wounds don't require loud healing. Some acknowledgments don't need elaboration." Afterward, I tucked myself into the reading nook beside the starboard windows. The space was small, half hidden by the curtain, the kind of place most people walked right past. I had loved it from the moment I boarded. I watched the water and thought of all the things I'd once needed to hear. "You were right. We should have included you. We're sorry." But they didn't come. And the strangest part was, I didn't need them anymore. Somewhere along the way, the hole I had tried so hard to fill with their approval had sealed itself. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but stitched shut by something I hadn't known I possessed. Strength born of being broken and choosing to stand anyway. That night, after the final dinner, the mood aboard the ship was fragile. There was laughter again, but it came in thin ribbons, not waves. No toasts, no performative speeches, just murmured conversations and clinking glasses that didn't ring quite as confidently. When I returned to our cabin, Lyle was already there, a small cup of tea in his hands, steam curling in slow spirals. He didn't say anything grand, didn't kneel, didn't try to erase the days before. He just handed me the tea and sat beside me. After a long pause, he said, "Thank you for staying. You could have walked." I looked at him. Looked. For the first time, I didn't see someone trying to win me back. I saw someone trying to show up. Not perfectly, but honestly. I didn't say, "I forgive you." It wasn't time for that. I simply placed my hand on his, just lightly, and that was enough. In the early hours of the morning, While most of the yacht still slept, I stepped onto the top deck again. There was no performance in it now. No need to be seen. The sky above me was soft and wide, the water below a silver mirror, smooth and endless. I caught my reflection in the glass door as I turned to head back inside. Not tentative, not waiting. Just me. When we returned to the house in Los Gatos, it greeted me like it had been holding its breath. Everything was exactly as I left it. Same creaky floorboard near the pantry, same stack of unread magazines on the end table, but everything felt different. I dropped the suitcase in the front hall and let the silence wrap around me. There were no missed calls, no texts from Valora. For the first time in years, I didn't check for one. Over the next few days, I unpacked slowly. Not just clothes, but everything I had carried home from that yacht. Truths, hard-won clarity, a spine that had grown itself back when I wasn't paying attention. On Wednesday afternoon, as I organized the drawer in the credenza, I found a note folded tightly between an old envelope and a wrinkled grocery list. My father's handwriting was unmistakable. Blocky, steady, neat. Don't fight for a seat. Build your table. I sat with it in my lap for a long while. I didn't remember when he'd given it to me. Maybe tucked into a birthday card. Maybe passed over quietly after a family dinner where I'd felt invisible and he had noticed. But it didn't matter. It had found its way back to me when I needed it most. The next morning, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I was still in my robe, sipping lukewarm coffee. The folded note from my father tucked between the pages of a book I wasn't reading. But when I saw the name, Maya, I put the cup down. Valora's niece. 23. Sharp-eyed, soft-voiced. She'd always been the quiet one at family events, lurking near the bookshelves, watching everything like she was assembling a puzzle in her head. "Hi, Marjorie," she said. "I hope I'm not crossing a line." She was nervous, but not uncertain. There was a difference. "I've been thinking," she continued, "about the trip, about you." I didn't say anything. I wanted to give her space to say what she meant. "You're the only one in the family who built something," she said. "Not inherited, not married into. You made it." Her voice was steady now, confident. "I'm applying for a business mentorship program," she added. "And I was wondering if you'd look over my application." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Yes," I said simply. Legacy, I realized, doesn't always start with thunder. Sometimes it starts with a phone call and a quiet request. A week later, I hosted Sunday brunch. Nothing elaborate. Scrambled eggs, buttered toast, and fresh strawberries in a ceramic bowl. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows like it had been waiting for us. Lyle made the coffee. Callista brought lemon bars still warm in a baking dish. Ronald came with his wife, and I gave them the sunniest seat near the bay window. I didn't invite everyone with the last name Preston. Just the ones who showed up when it mattered. The ones who knew how to sit at a table and talk. As Lyle refilled mugs, I said to him, "Not everyone needs to come." He looked up at me, curious. "Just the ones who belong," I added. "By spirit, not blood." He leaned down and kissed my temple. I had traded legacy for truth, I thought, and it fit better. Later that afternoon, as I rearranged the dining room bookshelf, I found myself wondering, if Valora had ever apologized, what would she have said? Would she have blamed pressure, family tradition, claimed she was protecting the family name? And if she had said all that, I would have smiled politely. Not to her, just to myself. "I forgive you," I would have said, "but I don't need you to say it, because some peace isn't shared, it's claimed." The dining table we had gathered around that day wasn't from Lyle's parents' house or Valora's luxury design collection. It was mine, picked out secondhand from a little antique shop in Sausalito. I had refinished it myself one summer, sanding it down between morning meetings and late-night emails. Not perfect, but sturdy. Built by hands that had finally stopped asking for a place and started making one. There was no toast that day, no speech, just conversation. Real, unscripted, full of tangents and pauses, and the kind of laughter that didn't need an audience. I looked around the room, at the people who had shown up. OT, because of obligation or performance, but because they wanted to be there. And I smiled. This seat was never given. I built it. That evening, after the dishes had been washed and the sun dipped behind the hills, I stepped outside to the porch with a blanket draped around my shoulders. The air was still warm, but the wind carried a crispness that whispered of change. I rocked slowly in the old chair my father had repaired for me when I first moved in. The same chair he once sat in with a coffee mug and a newspaper folded in half on his knee. Back then, I thought I needed everyone to approve of me to feel like I belonged. But the truth is, belonging isn't granted. It's claimed, like land staked after a long walk through uncertain terrain. I used to believe that if I just followed the rules, kept my voice soft, stayed agreeable, proved myself over and over again, then maybe someone would finally look at me and say, "Yes, you've earned your place." But places earned by someone else's rules are never truly yours. Now I saw it. You don't need to be invited when you've already built your table. You don't need to be celebrated when you've learned how to live without applause. You just need to show up for yourself, fully, repeatedly, without apology. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do isn't to fight louder. It's to stand still, to claim space without asking, to stop shrinking. And when you do, when you finally stop bending yourself into someone else's idea of acceptable, you'll find that peace isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet breath at the end of a long day. The night before we returned to shore, I didn't sleep. I walked to the top deck in silence, barefoot again, coffee cradled in both hands. The sea below was calm, almost glass-like, the stars barely blinking overhead. For once, there was no heaviness in my chest, no tension between my shoulder blades, just air. Cool, crisp, and mine. I caught my reflection in the glass door on the way back in. Not tentative, not waiting. Just me. When we got home, the house greeted me like it had been holding its breath. Everything looked the same. The creaky spot by the pantry, the stack of magazines no one ever finished, the faint scent of lavender in the hallway. But it all felt different. Or maybe I did. I set my suitcase down without urgency. No missed calls, no messages from Valora. And for the first time in years, I didn't check for one. Over the next few days, I unpacked slowly. Not just clothes, but papers, conversations, truths I had carried back from that yacht like sea salt clinging to skin. I slipped them into drawers, into folders, tucked away, but not hidden. On Wednesday afternoon, I was organizing the credenza in the hallway when I found it, tucked between an old grocery list and a greeting card, a small folded note. My father's handwriting, blocky, neat, purposeful. Don't fight for a seat. Build your table. I sat with the paper in my lap for a long time. I had no memory of when he gave it to me. Maybe it had been quietly slid into a birthday card, or maybe it had just waited there, hidden, until the moment I needed it most. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, my phone rang again. Maya. "I hope this isn't a bad time," she said. "I just wanted to say thank you for reading my application." She paused. "And for saying yes. I think I've always admired you. I just didn't know how to say it." My throat tightened. Not with sadness, but something older, deeper, a recognition. "You said it perfectly," I told her. We said goodbye, and I lingered on the porch long after the call ended, staring out at the street where nothing moved. A week later, I hosted another brunch. No guest list. Just a few people who'd shown me, again and again, that showing up mattered. Lyall brought pastries from a local bakery. Callista arrived early to help set the table. Ronald and his wife came with a bottle of cider, and that familiar look of having something to say, and finally feeling safe enough to say it. Maya was the last to arrive. She wore jeans and a navy blazer, and when she hugged me, she held on a beat longer than I expected. The table wasn't fancy, the plates didn't match. The flowers in the vase were from the grocery store. But there was laughter, real, messy, unscripted laughter, and no one checked their phone. We talked about Maya's program, Callista's new article, Ronald's quiet decision to step down from the There was no toast, no big speech, just space. The kind that doesn't demand applause, that doesn't shrink to fit someone else's I looked around the room and felt it deep in my bones. This was mine. Not because I forced everyone to stay, but because I stopped and started choosing who got to belong with me. Later, I pulled her face and thought about the silence that followed the truth. Her wide eyes across the table. Her tight smile, finally unraveling. She hadn't reached out since that night. No texts, no calls, not even her usual passive-aggressive, hope you're well emails. And I was okay with that. Some silences don't ache, they heal. Just before bed, Lyle handed me a mug of tea again. No grand gestures, just small ones that showed he had been paying attention. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how long it took me to see what was right in front of me." I didn't answer, not with words. I just looked at him. Looked. He was still learning. Still unlearning. But he was here. I rested my hand over his, gentle but solid. That was enough. The next morning, I stepped into the dining room again and ran my hand across the table's surface. The same table I had sanded until my hands blistered. The one I'd stained in 3 coats and sealed under the light of a reading lamp. It wasn't just furniture, it was proof. Of survival, of strength, of choosing to stand even when no one cheered. And when I thought about everything, the yacht, the documents, the betrayal, the quiet shifts in glances and tones, I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt stillness, a kind of peace that didn't need validation. I had finally stopped defending my place. I was simply occupying it. And that, I realized, was the real legacy. Not the boat, not the business, but the quiet presence of someone who refused to disappear. There's something profound about building your own space, your truth, especially after years of being made to feel invisible. This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There were no trophies, no applause, just clarity and peace, and the quiet, sturdy kind of pride that comes from knowing you stood up when it mattered most. I didn't need Valora's apology. I didn't need the family's approval. What I needed, what I had earned, was the right to stop shrinking, to stop asking for permission to be here. And maybe that's the hardest part. Not fighting back, but refusing to vanish. To hold your place when the silence gets heavy and your voice feels too small. But the truth is, some of the strongest moments in life are the quietest ones. When you say, "I'm here," and mean it. When you build something with your own hands and stop waiting to be invited in. When you realize that legacy isn't what you're given, it's what you create when no one else believes in you. So if you've ever been made to feel like an outsider in your own home, your own family, your own story, I hope you remember this. You are not alone. And you don't have to wait for someone to hand you a chair. You can build your table, sand the corners, set the plates, invite only those who see you, and then sit down, fully, finally, without apology. This seat was never given. I built it.